Hello and welcome to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, the Syrian army has taken full control of dozens of towns in Aleppo's northwestern countryside, where anti-Assad insurgents were holding on to their last stronghold. These advances were made after President Bashar al-Assad's forces drove insurgents from the M5 highway linking Aleppo to Damascus with the help of heavy Russian airstrikes and aided by pro-Iranian militias. Now, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has warned on Monday that the war against opposition forces and militia was not yet over. Let's take a listen.
We're fully aware that this liberation does not mean the end of the war, nor the collapse of schemes, nor the demise of terrorism, nor does it mean that the enemies have surrendered. But it certainly means they're rubbing their noses in the dirt as a prelude for complete defeat sooner or later. The battle to liberate Idlib and Aleppo countryside is ongoing regardless of some of the empty bubbles of the sound coming from the north, as well as the battle for liberating all Syrian soil, crushing terrorism and achieving stability.
Bashar al-Assad there, the battle for Idlib continues. Now, according to the latest figures by United Nations, over 900,000 Syrians, mostly children and women, have been displaced since December in northwest Syria, where this offensive is taking place. More than 40,000 have been displaced in the last 4 days alone from western Aleppo province. What is the future of the Idlib offensive? Let's find out from our guests. We are joined today by Mr. Hasasu, Analyst, and also the output manager at TRT Arabic. He's joining us today from Istanbul. We also have with us Mr. Fadel, Abdul, Ghany, and Analyst joining us from London. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. Where exactly are we when it comes to Russian and Turkish delegations? They've been discussing the tense situation in Idlib. Mr. Hasasu, your comments beginning the show with, are they going anywhere?
Turkish foreign ministry is built on really trying everything in the diplomacy side in these kind of cases. We remember the disagreements between the US and Turkey about the YPG presence in Syria. Turkey tried to really do its best to solve the problem in diplomatic ways, but when it understood that the US authorities are not really replying, they acted on the field, and that made the US authorities to come a deal with the Turkish officials. Now Turkey is using the same tactic with Russia. They don't want to lose an ally in the region. They are dealing with this delegate matter very sensitively, and the Turkish delegation in Moscow, which headed by the Deputy Foreign Minister Sedat Önal, is trying to do its best with the intelligence officers and the army officials with him in Moscow to find a solution to this problem. And I think Turkey is going to do its best to understand if there is anything left to do diplomatically to solve it. Then the field could be another option for Turkey.
Mr. Ghany, as Mr. Hasasu said, he continues to push the political mandate that this should be resolved politically, de-escalation should take place. But let's face it, those peace accords, those agreements back in September 2018 between Turkey and Russia, which talked about this very de-escalation to avoid this very situation where hundreds of thousands of civilians are the ones who are paying the price as the Syrian regime advances. It seems like that all those peace deals are essentially dead.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that the comparison between the Russian and the United States is unfair, actually. Russia is an unreliable party which has committed hundreds of war crimes against Syrians. Russia cannot be trusted, and we test Russian. We test the Russian in Dar'a, in Eastern Ghouta. They seized Eastern Ghouta, then Dar'a, then north of Homs. They support totally Assad against every side, actually, especially in the United Nations via 13 veto via also supporting against any types.
Mr. Hasasu, Russians cannot be trusted, as Mr. Ghany said. I mean, just talking about the current situation, more than 1,800 civilians have died. 1,800 Syrians have been killed by regime forces, Russian forces, since the beginning of this so-called 2018 ceasefire. And especially, let's not forget what was decided on January 12th and how the offensive started. Do you also subscribe to the opinion that Russians aren't really the most reliable ally here?
Well, from the Turkish perspective, Turkish officials don't rely on any of these parties. They are trying to make fair and transparent agreements with them to address these kind of problems, especially in Syria. But if they don't really meet these agreements, they act on the field. So, I mean, we were not really comparing US to Russia, but the Turkish diplomacy style in the region in case of dealing with this kind of problems. And in the recent days, the indiscriminate bombardment from the regime and the Russian air forces in Idlib area towards the civilian population shows that they are using the civilians or the migration of these civilians as a tool of saying to the West that they will continue to act so to bomb these areas to scare the other controlling powers in the region. But as you may know, there were attacks targeting Turkish soldiers in the region, and the President
13 were killed
has
just
warned.
in a span of 1 month. But I want to interject here, because you keep saying that if they do not follow the agreements that have taken place for de-escalation, the thing is, when Russia backs the Syrian regime with air power, continues to kill civilians in Aleppo, and as Bashar al-Assad said, that while they've taken this over, this is not the end, that they will continue fighting. It seems like they sign off on whatever agreement there was, and they haven't been following and don't plan to.
Yes, and this is the core of the problem. And Turkey is trying to find a way out of this this serious problem, because they signed another thing on the table, and now Russia is acting differently and pushing Turkey really on a corner, which will make it uncomfortable against all the Syrians who are immigrant Syrians who are living in Turkey, the opposition, and the Europeans as well.
Right. Now, I hear you on that front, pushing Turkey in a corner while Turkey continues to try and find some breakthrough through diplomacy. But then what we're hearing from the Turkish foreign minister, that if necessary, we will take other steps. What other steps is he alluding to?
The necessary steps, even if in the expense of really damaging some other relations between Russia and Turkey, because the story is not all about Idlib only. This is about the region and the future of the region. So Turkey really tries to, I think, to give the message to Russia that they are ready to do what they did with the U.S., according to what they did against the YPG group inside Syria. So Turkey is ready, actually, and they are determined to do what they said. But before that, Turkey is warning that this could change the matter in a way that they can't really go back and fix it again. So they are making sure that the other side is really getting the message, and they are not bluffing, and they are really determined to do what they are saying. So, but at the same time, Turkey is on the field, and it's neighboring to Syria. Russia has the air power, but it doesn't have the main manpower on the ground. Iran does, but not a big manpower, and it's actually weakened by the economical and political environment in the region. So everyone has advantages and disadvantages in this case, and we, I think, have to wait and see what's going to happen at the end of these meetings that comes up.
Okay, so we have to see what happens at these meetings. But meanwhile, Syrian forces seem to be And here I refer to what Bashar al-Assad said in the soundbite that you just heard, Mr. Ghany, when he talks about that this is an ongoing battle, but he also says it certainly means rubbing their noses in the dirt as a prelude for complete defeat sooner or later. Is this a victory? Do you see it as a victory for Bashar al-Assad, what has happened in Aleppo?
I don't think that this is the victory. And this is victory of the Russian forces, actually. And this is a major power in the world. We are not, like the Syrian population is not only against Bashar al-Assad, against the Iranian militia, and against the Russian folks of airplanes, which is like targeting mainly the civilians, and that lead to these waves of displacement. So based on that, Bashar al-Assad is just a pawn in the Russia hand, actually. And we cannot like segregate between the Russian and Bashar al-Assad. It's very much difficult, actually. And I think that the goal of the Russian is to seize all the territory, to avoid any types of accountability, because the Russian is committed hundreds of crimes against humanity and war crimes in Syria. Also Bashar al-Assad, we are unable to like overcome that Bashar al-Assad is alleged criminal, because he is the lead of the Syria army, and Syria army is accused by several bodies in the United Nations by accusing crimes against humanity and war crimes. So that lead us how they overcome this dilemma by seizing all the territory and reach to settlement that okay, remove these crimes and then reach to impunity by maybe mutual government or something like this. Russia will never like let Bashar al-Assad alone. They will continue seizing more territory, and they will continue to pressure the Turkish government as well. Like thousands now gathered on the Turkish border, and then there is like a humanitarian crisis taking place on those borders, and then pressurize the Russian government to open the border. And already
they're pressuring the Turkish forces. You're talking thousands that have gathered on the borders there with Syria. In fact, by one account, 700,000 more Syrians are making it to the border to seek asylum, to seek refuge in Turkey. The big problem for Turkey there, Mr. Hasasu, the US President, Donald Trump also called Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and said, and thanked him and said that, thank you for preventing a humanitarian catastrophe in northwestern Syria. Tell me, the 18,000 that have been killed so far, what is President Trump considering them as collateral damage?
Well, of course. I mean, the whole Syrian civil war is a shame and in the history of the West, both the Europeans and the Americans. They didn't really did their best to prevent what happened in Syria and what continues to happen. So all these, especially in Turkey, considered as only words. They have no weight on the field. International community has gave up on the civilians and their demands. And there are more than 3 million people living in Idlib area only. And these people are insisting to live in their own country. But unfortunately, the situation is forcing them to act otherwise. And we don't know. I mean, Turkey will continue to see their needs. And if needed, of course, it will open the doors for these people. But under these circumstances, they are trying to keep them there, convincing them that they are still safe or there are still safe areas. But this bombardment, actually, that takes place, especially within the last couple of months, is proving otherwise, and it's not giving any other chance to most of the families who are trying to found a shelter for their children and family.
Mr. Jan Hasasu joining us, Abdul, thank you so much for your opinion there. Coming back to you, Mr. Abdul Ghany, some analysts believe that Turkey wants its military presence in Syria, in Idlib especially, so to in future extract concessions from the regime. And But the way things are going on the ground, with the regime continuing to take back rebel-held areas, areas that have been held by rebels backed by Turkey, seems that Turkey's leverage is significantly reduced.
Indeed, actually, and they are like talking about like Adana agreement, which is like talking about 13 kilometers, but now we notice that Assad seizing like territory and area which is like approximately 15 kilometers and 20 kilometers from the Turkish border. So even Adana is now being violated. And Assad will seize, as I mentioned, with the Russian, will continue with this threatening. For example, I'm giving you from what's going on like past couple of days. Assad is shelling Idlib. Assad is shelling and Al-Atarib, which is like very close to the border, and which is far also from where is the like clashes or the border between Assad army and the opposition. So he's like targeting and shelling areas which is inside and inside the opposition area. That means he is intended to seize and to reach to those areas and want the people there not to be feel settled and not to be comfortable, and also to displace and push them toward more north and toward like further camps on the border. This is the Assad strategy, and I think that the Russian is totally support him, and I think that at this stage they might be ceasefire, but to acknowledge what's the advance on the ground, and maybe after a few months again we have other campaign and seizing more territories, and that's what's being done. We remember that we've been together in Khan Sheikhoun. Before Ma'arat al-Nu'man, Khan Sheikhoun being seized a couple months ago, and now at this past months, Ma'arat al-Nu'man being seized. After maybe few months, we'll notice that Idlib being seized. This is very clear, and I think that anyone being fooled by Russian is, I think this is like out of expectation, because the Russian exists in Syria for decisive winning.
Okay, Mr. Fadel Abdul, thank you for joining us. Let's add another voice to this conversation. Dr. Yahya Aridi is joining us from France. He's a politician and a representative of the Syrian Negotiations Commission. Dr. Aridi, thank you for joining us once again on Newswire. The situation on the ground, what is the sentiment of the political parties, of what little that do exist at the moment, with the way that Bashar al-Assad has gone forward in retaining these, in taking back these areas, these rebel-head areas, considering that nearly 1 million, mostly women and children, Syrians have been displaced?
I think politics has no place now in what is going on. And this is to the advantage of the regime that has defied, that has rejected, that has weaseled out from any political process with the help of the Iranians and the Russians. This is one. Another thing, when we talk about control on geography, we are actually mistaken, because the conflict is not one of geography. Assad, at the beginning in 2011, had full control of Syrian geography. But people revolted against the regime. The same thing is happening now, but with one additional fact, which is the tragedy resulting from the inhuman and uncivilized and irresponsible atrocities being perpetrated, not only by the regime, but by all those who support it. A third point I may add is that the control on geography is not by the power of the Assad regime's soldiers. He doesn't have any more. He just has militias who would confiscate homes and places where people's homes after they are being uprooted or displaced. It is the power of the Russian jets and the Iranian
militias,
Revolutionary Guard militias and Hezbollah. So, and he brags in a speech that he controlled Aleppo. And this is really fake. It is a propaganda. It is the neo-Goebbelsism, like the Hitler's Minister of Information. This is what is happening. It is a real...
Dr. Yahya Aridi, if Bashar al-Assad doesn't have the control of Aleppo and the other rebel-held areas he is so bent upon taking, at the cost of the millions who are not just being displaced, thousands are dying in the process, who really has the trump card here?
Well, you know, that area in the north had the so-called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or al-Nusra. And it was labeled as terrorist organization. It was really a plague. Not only, it was a plague on civilians there. It was through connections of its leaders with the regime, with Iran, with America, with others. Its intelligence all over the world, they had connections with this organization. And it provides the regime and the Russians with the excuse, with the pretext to do militarily whatever they want. And this is happening at the expense of civilians. Hundreds of thousands fled to the north, despite the fact that the Russians and the regime started their propaganda that they are making crossing or exits that they can go through towards the regime area. They did not. They headed north. Why? Because they cannot have any safety if they go there. They would either kill them or jail them. This is what is happening. And Turkey had a real national security concern. That is why it interfered through protecting those civilians and at the same time protecting its borders from PYD and PKK and to create a safe zone.
Right. The Syrian Democratic Forces are in particular something that Turkey has been trying to dominate the area so that with that they can use some kind of influence on the Syrian regime on how the SDF, the YPG, what they consider as a terrorist organization, that is Ankara does, how they are controlled later in the future. Here, let me just add one more voice to this conversation. We have with us Mr. Mathios, Jose Fides, a geopolitical researcher joining us from Athens. Welcome to Newswire. The conundrum really is, Marios, what we're trying to figure out here, that while analysts talk about Russia cannot be trusted here, all the peace agreements that Turkey and Russia had on de-escalation in Syria have pretty much gone dead. What are you expecting in the weeks ahead? As some analysts are saying, the Syrian regime is going to continue even after breaks with their offensive.
As I hear from the previous speaker, I hear about the need of Turkey to secure a safe place. But I cannot see any safe place. I see just a regime, the legal regime of Syria, that tries to control the country from illegal militias with a terrorist agenda and secure, the only one that can secure and save the population and the civilians in Syria are the Syrian regime. And the Syrian regime proved it in many cases, like saving the Christians and the Alevites from the ISIS attacks. And unfortunately, Turkey has a very bad role on this that happened now. It's very strange to hear Turkey that tries to save the condition in Syria, as all of us we know that Turkey is one of the countries that really managed the Syrian civil war to happen by involving in the internal affairs of Syria. Really, it's something very strange to hear when we have many proofs that Turkey gives weapons in ISIS, gives weapons in other Syrian rebels and find way not just to involve in another country, but at the same time to occupy places that want to annex this country from North Syria.
But Mr.
This is what I have to say about it.
Let me ask you then that who is responsible for the 1,800 civilians who have been killed in these attacks, which were backed by Russian Air Force and Iranian militias since the 2018 ceasefire? Who should take responsibility for it? Turkey?
There is possible can take European Union, NATO, United States, Syria, and Turkey and the other Arab nations that involved in a crisis that have to do only with the policy of Syrian people.
These attacks were carried out by regime forces. These attacks were backed by Russian air forces. Are you telling me that nearly 1 million women and children, mostly who have been displaced in Syria, the Syrian regime has absolutely no responsibility for it?
This is a war. Unfortunately, it is a war. And in the war happen very bad things.
This is a war between a dictator who wants to take back his place in a country which rejected him, and at the cost of those who are losing their lives, who are innocent. Who is he protecting? Which hearts is he winning in this war?
As I know, Assad have been elected from the people. I didn't see any elections from the place that the Syrian rebels, by the way, hold their positions now.
Okay, Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, why don't I give you this opportunity to comment. Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad is the leader of the Syrian people, irrespective of the body count.
Well, democracy and elections, democratic elections, require responsibility. If a person is elected democratically, at least he would shoulder responsibility towards people. You know that half of the Syrian population is displaced and uprooted because of the brutality of the regime. That's one. When he couldn't defeat the people, he called upon the Hezbollah militias, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and despite that, he couldn't defeat the people. Later on, he had to call on Russia. So a democratically elected leader or leadership cannot do that, bring occupation in order to protect a bloody chair he has been sitting on for 20 years. That's one. Another thing, when we talk about Turkey, Turkey cannot be blamed for having security issues at the border. This has been on for decades, that conflict. Now, people fled to Turkey. Turkey now hosts around 4 million Syrians. And these terrorists also penetrate into Turkey and create security problems. Now, the whole world now is turning a blind eye to the plight of Syrian people, and you would find propagandists who are with the regime. I don't blame them, because this is misinformation and misinformation. You find somebody like the leader of in brackets, Syria, yesterday talking about controlling Aleppo, liberating the rural area of Aleppo from their people. You go ahead and liberate the Golan Heights, which is occupied by Israel. This is liberation, not liberating homes from their people, from their dwellers, from their inhabitants, from their innocent children who are being killed.
Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, you're making a very critical point there. Liberation means liberating the country from oppressors, not from the very civilians, the very citizens of that country. And with that, thank you, Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi and Mr. Mathios, for lending your voice in this conversation. We'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Our second story that we're discussing is about the European Union finally agreeing on Monday to launch a new naval and air mission to stop more arms reaching the warring factions in Libya. As per the global arms embargo that was and continuously has been violated. Now, the biggest opposers to this were Austria and Hungary. They were worried that this naval mission would attract more migrants and enable them to reach Europe. However, there were some agreements on that, were some modifications on the agreement, in fact, to which they then withdrew. We'll be talking a little more about what their concerns were. Also, the European Foreign Policy Chief, Mr. Josep Borrell Fontelles, now, he's been very critical in the past about the need for unanimity among all member states so they could come together to make a decision on how they would address what is unfolding in Libya. He seems to have finally got everybody on board, but for how long? And what are the caveats here? We'll be talking about that and more with our guests. Let me introduce who we have to the panel. We have with us Mr. Semir Sejfovic, an analyst joining us from Istanbul. Also with us from London, we have Mr. Stephan, a journalist who covers Libya for The Guardian. Welcome to both of you to the show. I want to start right off the bat to understand, Mr. Sejfovic, from you, what were the biggest concerns that Austria and Hungary had to this naval mission, and how have they been addressed?
Well, in terms of Hungary and Austria, I believe that the concerns that they had is shared among most southern European countries, and that is stopping the migrant flow from Libya and other African countries into the European Union. We've seen Italy and Spain put in extra efforts to monitor the Mediterranean, especially the Mediterranean Sea here between Greece and Turkey. So Austria and Hungary are sharing concerns basically of other EU nations. The EU seems more concerned about allowing further migrants into Europe than the actual Libyan conflict going on. During my time there, when I was reporting, most journalists coming from France and Italy were more interested in stories about migrants and the state of migrants in Libya than the actual conflict, which was very intense during that time. Mm-hmm. So that kind of tells you why Europe is forming this, let's say, Mediterranean marine type patrol. It's not about stopping the weapons of coming into Libya. Libya's had stockpiled weapons for the past 40 years and has enough weapons to go on forever if it wants to go to war.
Mr. Stephan, the new mission says that it will, they talk about it, that the new mission will be limited to the Eastern Mediterranean, whereas which is the area where most of the arms smuggling seems to have been taking place. Your thoughts on whether this will effectively not only just stem that flow of arms, but also not encourage those illegal migrants?
Well, yes, as your other speaker said, they don't want to have any migrants. So the Austria and Hungary have insisted that this mission, it happens a long way from Libya, so that no migrant craft will reach them. But the problem is that although they can stop stuff coming in by sea, a lot of things come in air and by land. Now, I mean, to actually police the land border is a huge undertaking because it's a massive border and it's across the desert. So I'm not sure that stopping ships on the high seas will be enough to stem the flow of arms.
Mm-hmm. Especially the kind of maritime agreement that has been signed between Turkey and Libya's GNA, the UN-recognized government. It really brings into question whether this sort of trepidation that those who are bringing in arms through air, will that be stemmed at all? Mr. Semir, your thoughts?
Well, I will give you a personal view of mine, very personal. I believe this is a very foolish thing to do in terms of the European Union parking their military ships on one side, which is the side of Tripoli. They've done this back in the 90s when Bosnia went to war and imposed a similar weapons embargo on Bosnia. But then on the other side, you had Serbia using land to provide its logistics and its troops, its separatist troops during that time in Bosnia. And you have that same scenario right now in Libya. Who is going to patrol, just like your speaker said earlier, who's going to patrol the borders of Egypt, Sudan, where we have proven facts of mercenaries and weapons coming through those borders? We have open statements by the president of Egypt saying that, they're supplying Haftar with weapons. And then you have the reports about the UAE and Sudan, and it's who's going to patrol those borders? So I think it puts the GNA in a very ungrateful position. It puts the GNA into a position of a siege, which Sarajevo was back in the 90s. So it's very ungrateful to have one side have access to weapons and the other side being imposed an embargo on.
Mr. Stephan, is that the motive here? Because as long as we don't address who is backing who, I mean, let's face it, the international backers for General Haftar, if they have complete access to getting through weapons and military and militias, it really is, there's no point for this naval mission.
UN also says that UAE, that Egypt and so on are supplying Haftar, and that comes across the land. So if you're only going to cut the sea route, then you're only going to help one side and stop another. And I think it also shows that the weakness of the EU and the UN, because last week the UN said, we have this arms embargo, we've had it for 9 years, now it has to be enforced. But then the UN looked around and think, well, we don't have any forces, who's going to do it?
Right.
So this week, the EU said, well, we'll do some of it. We'll do stuff at sea. But I mean, as you say, if you don't stop the land border and the air deliveries, you're not actually stopping the weapons.
It's a very biased approach here. It's a very biased approach because what became of that 55-point roadmap that they had come up with in ending the war in Libya, which was not only agreed by 12 key leaders at the Berlin conference earlier in mid-January. In fact, it was also endorsed by the UN Security Council. And then we heard more about it in the Munich conference on Sunday. Despite all of that, there continues to be violations to those very 55 points agreements.
Yes, and if the outside nations are not willing to stop, it's impossible to stop it. I mean, the whole point about the UN is it's supposed to bring outside states together to say, look, we have to stop this. We have to stop supplying weapons and support. And they can't get that these outside states won't stop doing it on either side.
Mr. Semir, then what realistic expectations should we have from this Joint Military Commission? This is sounding from what I've heard from both of you is that it's going to be a complete disaster.
Well, I'm just going to say one thing. Nobody's going to stop the Turks in the Mediterranean. The Turks will not be encircled, and they have made those points very clearly in the past. Mm-hmm. Remember, the international community got very active in Libya when Erdogan, the president of Turkey, announced that Turkey is going to send military assistance to Libya. The Turks are the only ones who haven't swapped deals since the fall of Gaddafi and before the fall of Gaddafi. This maritime agreement was kind of negotiated and engineered in the times of Gaddafi. So now that Turkey has gotten involved, and then you have Greece, who's a NATO ally of Turkey, in collusion with the United States, discussing the removal of U.S. bases from Incirlik to possibly Greece. And then you have territorially debated islands, which Turkey is claiming between Greece, and Greece doesn't want to have these discussions either. So keeping Turkey out of Libya is going to be very hard. And if Europe is indeed trying to do that, it's going to raise even further tensions, not just in the Mediterranean, but in terms of the refugee crisis between the European Union and Turkey. We know that Turkey has had problems, and France has had problems with Turkey alongside with Egypt. So I think that this is only going to further complicate things. If this is the intention of Europe, I honestly don't believe it's going to succeed. Turkey has set its course.
Right, but Turkey's also said that they want to remove Haftar from the equation because Haftar is out to have not have a political solution to this problem. Here, we're running out of time. Mr. Stephan, very quickly, there's going to be another meeting coming up ahead where representatives of the GNA, of Haftar's LNA are scheduled to meet, the Joint Military Commission, and they're going to have the second round of talks in Geneva under the UN to agree to a lasting ceasefire. What are your expectations for that?
Expectations are very low. I mean, there are many meetings. There's the Geneva thing going on. There's the Munich meeting. There was the Berlin meeting. The African Union are having meetings. They can't. There's no diplomatic power or will to stop this war. So I don't see any breakthroughs coming.
Mr. Stephan and Mr. Sejfovic, thank you so much for lending your voice here on Newswire. Unfortunately, we've run out of time to this very lively, interesting discussion. We will see you tomorrow with a new episode of Newswire. Till then, goodbye.